Welcome back to another episode of the Never Drop Podcast. So, what we're going to talk about, dissect, kind of recap this past weekend, the Tony Harrison versus Tim Tszyu fight. I got to say, man, Tim Tszyu impressed me in this fight. I underestimated him, as if you had listened to my preview, I had picked Tony Harrison to just outbox him. And Tim Tszyu didn't allow any of that. It looked like the first round, which both fighters were really inactive. It looked like that might have been the only round Tim Tszyu lost. He was dominant throughout, and then officially ending the night with a 9th round TKO with a barrage of uppercuts that had me from my couch yelling at the ref to stop the fight because I was scared Tony Harrison was going to take a few too many. But Tim Tszyu, man, he looked dominant. He set up a fight with Jermell Charlo. Charlo looks ready. Tszyu looks ready. I think this fight really makes that Charlo fight even bigger, looks even better, because before it's like, okay, it's a mandatory defense for Charlo. Now it's like, all right, yeah, this man Tim Tszyu's a bad guy. He's a bad dude when he gets in that boxing ring. So I think that makes that fight look so much better at 154. And he just dominated Tony Harrison, and really, I sat there and was like, wow, I really underestimated Tim Tszyu. He is a great, I want to say great, he's a really, really good boxer, and he can pose some threats for Charlo. So with that, let's kind of just get in, about the fight, what I saw, what happened to Tony Harrison, because that was not the Tony Harrison I expected to see in the ring that night. If you're listening on Spotify, Apple Podcast, anywhere, I'd appreciate if you click the follow button so you stay up to date on all the new episodes I drop. I've talked about it. Boxing's continually rolling on these next couple months, so every time you want to listen to what I got to say or want to keep updated on what's going on in boxing, click that follow button. If you're listening on YouTube, click that subscribe button. I'm always going to talk about, big fights, big fight news, the big fighters, not even just big fighters. If there's a boxing fight that interests me, I'm going to talk about it. So I'd appreciate if you followed, subscribed, whatever you're listening on. Just keep updated with the Never Drop Podcast and what I'm dropping. Appreciate that. And with all that being said, let's get straight into this fight. So taking a deeper dive kind of into this fight, let's start with the victor, Tim Tszyu, and what he did well in this fight. I predicted, Tszyu was going to face a barrage of jabs, which we did see Harrison do. But honestly, that's about all Harrison did. So once Tszyu realized, and that first round, again, the first round I think is the only round Tim Tszyu might have lost in that fight. But I think once he realized all he has right now is the jab, Tszyu started throwing the right hand. He'd throw the left, he'd throw the right. He was throwing some power punches. He wasn't jabbing much. He wasn't going to the body. But he was throwing the left, the rights. He'd throw some combinations, some uppercuts. And he was connecting on a lot of them. I think it was either the second or third round he landed a right that stung Harrison. And you kind of knew right there, all right, it's going to be Tim Tszyu's night. Because Harrison was already back to the ropes. And I was expecting Harrison a lot more movement on him. But Tszyu was walking him right down, keeping him on the ropes. The broadcast had talked about it being a smaller ring. I'm not completely sure about that. I think that was because it was in Australia, actually. So Tszyu had it smaller because he was the A side. But it just seemed like he was keeping Harrison on the ropes the entire fight. And that's not where Harrison wanted to be. You could see his brother, who was his trainer, Harrison, tell him, you got to get off the ropes, you got to keep moving. But Tszyu wouldn't allow that. He was hitting with the right hand, and then eventually just all came to a peak in the 9th round when he was just teeing off on Harrison. That was, for a second, that was scary. I was like, oh my goodness, this is going to get really bad for Harrison. And I still think the ref stopped it too late. I think he could have stopped it 5 seconds earlier and everyone would have been fine with it. Harrison's whole head was turning around, it seemed. But either way, a great showing by Tszyu. But, this is what I saw. Jermell Charlo, he was on the broadcast, and he was saying, and I saw Derek James on another podcast, his trainer, Charlo's trainer. was saying that, wasn't anything new from Tim Tszyu. He's a power puncher that's going to come in to you. He's going to walk you down. He's not going to throw many jabs, not go to the body as much. And, to a T, that's kind of what Tim Tszyu did in this fight. He didn't throw many jabs. He didn't go to the body. But that's the thing. When he lands those power punches, you're going to feel it. And Tony Harrison felt it. Granted, we do know Tony Harrison is someone who kind of fades as the rounds go on, which evidently was the case in this fight. But still, he's a formidable foe. And you got to give Tim Tszyu all the credit, because this was a opponent I wouldn't have taken if I was in his position. I would have waited for Charlo to get back. He didn't have to take this fight. So all props to him, and he makes this Charlo fight look better because he beat the man who beat the man in Charlo. Granted, that was 5 years ago, but still, that one on Charlo's record was from Tony Harrison. So you got to give Matt all the props, all the respect to Tony Harrison, not to Tony Harrison also, but also Tim Tszyu, who came out victorious in this fight. But I think if you had watched Tim Tszyu's fights before, you didn't see too much that was different in this fight. And I don't know if you can really stack up Tony Harrison on the level of Jermell Charlo, especially now, later in their careers, respectively. They're just two different fighters with two different type of games. So all the props to Tim Tszyu. He came in there with a game plan, executed it, and got done early, and had himself a night in his home country of Australia. On the other hand, Tony Harrison, man, I had talked about in my preview, I was expecting jabs, movement. With Tim Tszyu's high guard, I thought Tony would go to the body, more jab, and then throw right hands to the to the face, to the head, kind of throw some combos, get in and out with the movement. Because again, Tim Tszyu's kind of a walking forward type guy, not straight line necessarily, but just walking forward, and I think the movement a boxer can create some different angles that Tim Tszyu, isn't accustomed when fighting. But that's not the Tony Harrison we saw. We didn't see the guy who we expected to put on a boxing clinic. We saw a guy who's throwing jabs, throwing the left jab, another left jab, get hit in the face with a right hand. It was watching it in that third round when he got hit with that right hand and was stunned. It was like, okay, Tony's in for a long night here, because it wasn't going to happen. It just seemed, unless he started moving, and I do think in the fourth round he started moving more to, okay, this is what I expected to see in the first couple rounds of the fight, with Tony Harrison moving, and then as the fight progresses, he continues to move and move and move. But in that fourth round, he just started moving, and that wasn't enough to win rounds. It was enough to, okay, Tony's in this round a little more than he was these past two rounds, but it wasn't much more than that. It wasn't definite that, okay, yeah, he won this round. So it was tough to watch as Tony Harrison just continued to get teed off on, and even his trainer, his brother, was saying, man, you got to stay off the ropes, you got to keep moving. And then the next round, Tony Harrison would primarily be on the ropes and not moving, trying to counter when, he's not the counter puncher in that fight. That's Tim Tszyu. I mentioned that before in the preview. Tim Tszyu's the counter puncher. He's going to counter you. Tony Harrison, he needs to get off first and move. And it seemed like he was trying to counter punch, and that wasn't going to work. That just wasn't going to be what was going to get the job done. And, it didn't. But you got to give Tony Harrison credit going over to Australia. Not necessarily short notice, but this wasn't like something 6 months planned out, this fight. And, man, I'm a Tony Harrison. I'm a fan. I think he's great. I love the trash talk he brings. I mean, he sold this fight a lot. I guarantee you a lot of people weren't going to watch this fight when it was announced. But as they went over to Australia and Tony Harrison was talking, he sold this fight. So even though we're not going to get, sadly, a Harrison-Charlo trilogy, I'm excited for this Tszyu versus Charlo fight that's coming up. And getting into that Charlo versus Tszyu fight, man, like I mentioned at the beginning, I think this fight just only got bigger, right? Because Tszyu was, all right, yeah, Charlo's got to face this guy from Australia. Dad's a former champion, Hall of Famer. All right, that's cool. Hasn't really faced anyone. I was like, okay, cool. I'm a watcher for Charlo. Undisputed, I'm a big fan of Charlo. But now it's like, oh, okay, these are two really good boxers getting in this ring. So I think this fight just through the roof made that Charlo fight with Tszyu better. I saw something saying Tszyu's pushing for potential late July fight in Vegas with Charlo. Charlo had mentioned on the broadcast, he said he was looking to return this summer, which would be awesome because obviously we've talked about this first half of the year for boxing. We get a Tszyu versus Charlo fight early second half of the year in July. That's just starting the second half of the year more than strong. That's a great fight to start the second half of the year with. But saying all that, Tony Harrison is not, or Jermell Charlo is not Tony Harrison. They're two different fighters. And I still think Charlo gets the victory, even though I'm not as confident. I was going in with 90% confidence, like, all right, Charlo's going to get this guy out, and, we're going on to the next guy. No, Tszyu proved he's a fighter, and he has skills. But I do think Charlo, with his power, with his chin, and with it, with the tutelage of Derek James, his trainer, I think he, this is my early prediction, I think he'd take care of Tim Tszyu, right? But it would be a much better fight than, I'd be going into the fight in January thinking it was when it was originally scheduled. So I'm really excited for that fight. I know Charlo had mentioned, we didn't see anything new from him. If you didn't see anything new from him, you did respect him after that fight. He went in there, got the job done, said, I'm going to fight Tony Harrison, and then I'm going to come get you, Jermell. And he did that, right? So now we're going to be set up with a battle for 154 undisputed, which, man, that's going to be a great battle. And Jermell looks ready, man. He, on the broadcast, he was sounding like he was ready for this fight. And yeah, I really think this is going to be a great fight. It's funny, I'd mentioned my preview, I talked so much about Charlo, right? And even though he's not fighting in this fight, his shadow just loomed over this fight. Like, all right, winner of this gets Charlo. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's Charlo next. And I thought it was funny they had him on the broadcast, just like, that's what so much of this fight meant. It was, all right, this is a stepping stone for who gets the champ, who gets the undisputed champ in Charlo. So I just thought it was, fitting that, I talked so much about Charlo in that preview. The broadcast has Charlo a part of the team calling the fight. Like, yeah, this is really a big part of what this Harrison versus Tszyu fight is. It's going to be to get to Charlo. So that's just what I want to talk about with the Harrison and Tszyu fight. Harrison didn't do too much that I anticipated him to do, so I expected him to outbox Tszyu, get a decision. Obviously didn't happen. And I do have to say, for Tony Harrison, it's a 32-year-old man. He had mentioned this in his press conference. He doesn't know how long he's going to keep doing this, Harrison, because imagine, for him to get in this position again, to fight for a chance to fight the champion, not even a fight against the 154 champion down the line, that semifinal, that fight before the final challenge, that'll take another 2 to 3 years. At that point, he's a 34, 35-year-old man. Boxing's a lot. So I wouldn't be surprised if Harrison takes a couple more fights and, calls it a career. I know he's doing training nowadays, and I'd love to see him in that capacity. I think he'd be great. I think he'd help promote fights. So I really, if this is one of the last big fights Tony Harrison has, man, we got to give him his props. It's always a joy watching him fight, always a joy watching his pressers. And you only wish the best for him. He always never backed down from a challenge. And Tony Harrison was one of those faces in boxing, one of those personalities in boxing that, yeah, that's why you watch the sport. a dude that was talking trash, gonna have fun, sell the fight. Tony Harrison was a great dude. So obviously he hasn't announced his retirement or anything. I'm sure he has a couple more fights in him. But if this was the last time we saw Tony Harrison on a huge stage, man, got to give him his props for everything. So that was my diagnosis of the fight, really. As I've said before, all the props to Tim Tszyu doing what he had to do, taking that fight, winning that fight. Now he gets undisputed champ in Jermell Charlo. That will be a fight. I can't wait to cover that fight when it gets officially announced. Between the press conference, they had one press conference over Zoom early January or mid-December, because he already announced he was injured mid-December over Zoom. They had a press conference, and Charlo, he's talking. We know Charlo, he likes to talk. So I think the press conference are going to be fun, because Tim Tszyu, he's calling him out. We saw him after the fight yelling, what's my name? Telling he was talking his talk to Tim Tszyu. So I think these press conferences are going to be a little more fiery than the ones in December. This fight's going to be a little more fiery. I think it's just going to be a great fight. I can't wait for it to happen in the summertime in Vegas. And really, it's just boxing keeps going and looking, up and up this year, which is amazing. So yeah, that's kind of my recap of the fight, my review of the fight. Coming up next in boxing, I'm not sure we have too much this weekend, but in less than 2 weeks, we get Caleb Plant versus David Benavidez. Man, oh man, I can't wait for that fight. Two guys that, we say a lot of times in boxing, yeah, they don't like each other. These guys hate each other. And I'll talk about that in my preview. Oh my goodness, I can't wait for this fight. I think it's really a 50-50 fight. And man, I can't wait for that. That's one of those that before all these fights have been announced, that was one of the first to be announced. And that was circled on the calendar. And even with all these other fights being announced, this has been triple circled, because this is a great fight. I can't wait to watch this fight, talk about this fight. That'll be coming in the next week or so. My preview for that fight, man, it's going down when Plant and Benavidez get in the ring. Two fighters I like both of them. So I'll have to really narrow down and pick one of them. I know which way I'm leaning, but it can change, man. It's changed a couple times since this fight's been announced. So we'll see what I pick officially. But I appreciate everyone tuning in, listening for this Harrison versus Tim Tszyu recap. Again, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, any of those streaming services, I'd appreciate if you followed me on this, whatever you're listening, so you just stay up to date on the new episodes. If you're listening to Never Drop Podcast on YouTube, subscribe, comment, like. I'd love to answer any questions, talk about anything. And again, I appreciate you if you're listening to the whole way through. I appreciate you. And, that's all I have for this episode. Appreciate it again. I'm out. Peace.